So my name is Judy Kilgallen. I'm Climate Change Lead with the Improvement Service. We're a support organisation for local government and partners. And coordination and collaboration is really key to what we do and to work to sort of draw on our wide reach into local government and the different partners we work with. So I'm really pleased to welcome you to this session, which came from a number of conversations around the importance of procurement in delivering climate action, along with those wider benefits for local communities and businesses. And that's really why we've called this event A Sustainable Future for people and for planet. It's very clear that there's lots going on with different methodologies and data, work, community wealth building, and today is very much part of that conversation and action that is already happening. And we're hopeful that this is an opportunity to help move things forward and have that sort of practical and action-focused discussion. The invite has gone throughout different public sector networks, so it's not just those working directly in procurement, but also more broadly. It's very aware that often the biggest impact is before things even come to formally starting the procurement. So it should be hopefully a good and interesting mix of people that we have. Just to start with a huge thank yous. I've already thanked everyone for coming along, but a huge thank you to Helene from Scotland Excel and her colleagues who've been a driving force in pulling this event together. Thank you also to the support and input from Scotland Government and that the work by Climate Exchange is Sustainable Procurement with Phil Duddle that we'll come on to. And of course, the Sustainable Scotland Network. For those of you who haven't come across SSN, I would encourage you to check out the work that they do. The Improvement Service, we work very closely with them whenever we can. And I'm delighted that George Tarvett, the director of the network, is going to be chairing the session today and take us through the presentations, and then there'll be time for Q&A and discussion at the end. Please do add comments and links into the Teams chat as we go. We should have plenty of time to pick up them. We'll also be making a note of them and sharing them. So if you have ideas and thoughts alongside any questions, then do post them in. So without further ado, I'll hand over to George. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Judy. And I suppose you've touched on many of the themes that we're trying to instill in this event: collaboration, coordination, and all pointing towards accelerating delivery. And we can only do that by actually working together. So hopefully the event itself is just a reflection how at the national level, a range of stakeholders involved in this are trying to sort of pull their efforts together. And thanks so much for everybody sort of joining today. We've got a lot to get through. So as the kind of chair, my main responsibility is to try and keep things on time. We've essentially got 3 presentations before we break for Q&A. We'd really welcome your contribution when we get to the Q&A. Just raise your hand and I'll try and bring as many of you in as I can. At the same time, use the Teams chat just to raise comments, questions, topics that we can pick up in the Q&A. Myself and Judy, I'll do a bit of a kind of tag team in terms of keeping an eye on the issues that are coming up. So please use the Teams chat to sort of share information and raise questions, and we'll get to that around about 3 o'clock. Like I say, we've got essentially the sessions in sort of 3 parts, 3 presentations. Initially, Joe Mitchell and Hannah Neufeld are with us from the Scottish Government. I think Hannah's going to lead on the presentation. Joe's going to be available for the Q&A panel session. And then we'll move on to Phil from Sustainable Procurement Limited, who's been working on the CXC research, and then on to colleagues from Scotland Excel, Mary Mitchell. So without further ado, I'm just going to hand over to, I think, Hannah. Hi, Hannah.
Brilliant. My tech tends to be slightly dodgy, so apologies all if I crash out, because that's what Wi-Fi does, isn't it? Right, I will share my screen and then hopefully we'll all be good. Can everyone see opening slide?
Yep, looks good.
Yep, lovely. Okay. So yeah, good afternoon. Just to reiterate, my name's Hannah Neufeld and I'm Senior Policy Advisor in the Net Zero Public Sector team at Scottish Government. That's in Domestic Climate Change Division. As George has mentioned, my colleague Jo Mitchell's here. I'm sure many of you will know her, and she's going to take part in a panel session. So I'm just here today to give a very quick overview presentation on Scope 3 emissions from procurement. So yeah, just to start, I'll give a quick overview of carbon emissions reporting. So public bodies are expected to report in line with the GHG protocol, and a body's emissions are split into 3 scopes. So scope 1 emissions are direct emissions, and most commonly that would be from burning fossil fuels such as gas for heating and petrol and diesel and fleet vehicles. But scope 1 also includes other direct emissions, so there's process emissions and fugitive emissions, and those could be, say, refrigerant gases lost from the cooling system, and there's other direct emissions which might be, for example, from the NHS anaesthetic gases. Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions from purchased electricity, heat, cooling, and steam. And for many public bodies, those are currently limited to purchase mains electricity, but could also include heat purchase from district heating networks. And then Scope 3 emissions are all other indirect emissions from the wider value chain but aren't already included in Scopes 1 and 2. So they include all upstream and downstream emissions and are split into 15 categories. So this slide illustrates the 15 Scope 3 categories in more detail. So it's important to note that not all categories will be relevant to all organisations. Some just won't apply, but also the impacts can be hidden. So for the public bodies reporting, the categories in green are reported on by at least some public bodies. So for example, category 3, fuel-related activities, that includes transmission and distribution losses from mains electricity. Waste, business travel, and staff commuting and home working are also reported by many bodies, and then upstream leased assets are relevant to some. But it's the categories highlighted in yellow, so purchase goods and services, capital assets, so that's the purchase or construction of new buildings, for example, and investments, which includes pension funds, where many bodies are most likely to have a major climate impact. And for the majority, that isn't being reported. So of the 188 bodies who submitted an annual climate change duties report last year, only 17 included emissions from procurement. So to give an idea of the expected scale of impact, it's estimated that public sector procurement activities are directly or indirectly responsible for 15% of global GHG emissions. And the Carbon Trust estimate that Scope 3 overall can make up to 90% of an organisation's footprint. And it's also estimated that purchase goods and services in particular for public body can account for over 70% of the footprint. So when it comes to estimating emissions from procurement, currently most of the more readily available tools, including many of those offered by external consultancies, rely on a purely spend-based method. So in this method, a carbon conversion factor per pound spent on a product category is applied. So that's got the benefit of being a relatively simple method, and it can be a really good starting point. However, by conflating spend and emissions to make it appear that your emissions have gone down, you just need to negotiate a cheaper price for the same volume of goods. And there can also be unintended consequences. So it can incentivize buying cheaper, less sustainable products, and it can actually deter investment in higher quality goods that have higher energy efficiency or are more sustainably produced, because those often carry a price premium. And we've actually been told about examples of that happening by the public sector. So while this method does have a value, for example, for an initial screening exercise to identify carbon hotspots, so that's product categories and suppliers with the highest carbon impact in your supply chain, it's not suitable to be used as it stands on an ongoing basis, and it's unsuitable for trend analysis. So you might, for example, work really hard to engage with your top suppliers, but any carbon reductions achieved just wouldn't show up. To capture that information, you need to start using a hybrid methodology. So the public sector is facing a number of challenges when it comes to estimating and reporting Scope 3 emissions from procurement. As I've just outlined, most available tools, especially the free-to-use ones, use a spend-based method. There can be issues with data availability and data maturity, and the process can be really resource-intensive and require expertise and time that many public bodies may struggle to provide. While external consultancies can obviously assist, that process is often costly. There's also questions over the accuracy of resulting carbon estimates if a spend-based or a primarily spend-based method's used, and then ultimately the usefulness of that data in driving outcomes, which is obviously emissions reductions. So just to provide a bit of wider background or drivers for the research, Scottish Government's currently developing new statutory guidance for public bodies to support them in putting their climate change duties into practice, and we want and need to include guidance around wider Scope 3 emissions than have been reported by public bodies to date. We want to drive improvements in the annual public bodies reporting, and there's outcomes linked to the ongoing Environmental Standards Scotland investigation. So we commissioned a piece of research through Climate Exchange, which is awarded to Sustainable Procurement Limited and Ether, who are going to present to you next, on driving emission reductions through the public sector supply chain. So on that note, I will hand back over to George and Philip's presentation. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Hannah. That's set out, I think, a lot of the activity that's been taking place here, both the drivers that are playing into this space. I think there's going to be more expectation on public sector bodies to show their workings around addressing procurement, and I think we are very conscious that we want to develop solutions, the rules, the tools, and the sharing of good practice, which is proportionate to the nature of the challenge. And we really optimize the use of data. We don't go chasing data just for the sake of it, and we really help support improved performance, improved action across the public sector. And I just wanted to mention, just before I pass on to Phil, I think an example of how SSN and the various partners that are on this call and who have brought this event together are working and are very alert to trying to make progress in this space. I think the CXC research really started from a bit of a conversation amongst SSN members, sort of getting together to say, look, we're all trying to do something in this space. How can we do it better? That was then picked up in many ways in a conversation between SSN steering group, Hannah, you and I, just sort of kicking it around a little bit. And there was this opportunity to get some resource through CXC into this space. And hopefully what you'll hear from Phil around, what does the landscape look like and what are some of the ways forward? We'll pick that up and then start to work out how do we actually take this forward. Again, very much thinking about how do you put policy into practice. So without further ado, Phil, I'm just going to hand over to yourself for your presentation.
Thanks very much, George, and thanks, Hannah. I will do the same. I'll just share my own slides. Just 1 second. And again, hopefully you can see those.
Yep, looks good.
Good. Okay, right. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. And first thing I should say is thank you to anyone on the call who provided evidence for us as part of the research. The research took place. We started in June, and the research element or stage of that has finished. We're now in the hopefully finalisation stage of getting the report concluded, which will, I should stress, be made publicly and freely available on the CXC website in the not too distant future. So what I'm going to do is just introduce the research, explain what we did, some of the findings that emerged from that, and some of the suggestions that we will be or have incorporated into the draft report, whether it's for Scottish Government, public bodies or elsewhere. I can't possibly go through the whole of the research in the time I've got, but hopefully it will give you a good flavour of what's taking place and what might be coming through the report when you see it. So the research was, as you'll see on the slide, entitled "To provide evidence to the Scottish Government on improving the ways in which public bodies can estimate and target their Scope 3 emissions and purchase goods and services." So that's picking up from what Hannah said. And to do that, we undertook a lot of engagement, interviews with public bodies, survey of public bodies, and a total of 72 participated in that. And that was asking public bodies about their use of supply chain emissions methodologies and tools, how they were applying relevant climate change issues within procurement, within the procurement cycle, what issues they had, what they were doing regarding climate change reporting, and any other challenges that they faced regarding this, a number of which Hannah has already picked up on in terms of resources, levels of understanding, etc. We also looked at a large number of supply chain emissions methodologies and other related tools. I stress other related because it's not just those tools we looked at where you can estimate or measure the emissions that arise from your procurement, from supply chain emissions. It's also those that suppliers may be using or are available to suppliers to enable them to calculate emissions and also report to public bodies those emissions potentially, and also category specific tools as well. I should stress that we can't possibly say that we have looked at every single methodology or tool out, or every single tool that's out there, because there are a lot of them and an increasing number of them. What we have attempted to do is to make sure that we're covering all the bases in terms of the types of tools and types of methodologies that are out there. We've also reviewed various guidance that's available to the public sector, to public bodies, and also case studies and examples of where climate change has been addressed within procurement. And also, we couldn't forget suppliers. So we established a survey through Public Contract Scotland of suppliers, and we had 67 responses to that. And that was trying to better understand where they are coming from in this space, what they're doing regarding their own carbon accounting, calculating their emissions or getting support on that, and in particular, what challenges they feel they face. Now, as Anna said, only 17 public bodies reported last year supply chain emissions and climate change reporting, and just over 50% have not yet, of those public bodies that reported back to us as part of the research, and I stress that wasn't obviously every public body, but it's quite a large proportion, just over 0.5% have not yet calculated those supply chain emissions. Again, as Hannah says, there is a reliance on the use of spend-based models, and that is principally because of the limited availability of supply chain emissions data, the availability of data from suppliers, despite the fact that public bodies, quite rightly, are increasingly seeking this. And the research was looking at the availability of data, but also how that data could become more available and more easy, if you like, to not just calculate, but also report and collate from a supplier and from a public body perspective. Public bodies are varying in the use of their tools, of various tools. Some have adopted or used the emissions that are publicly available and calculated themselves by mapping those emissions to procurement categories. Some have used support from consultancies, and some have been using various tools that are out there, some of which come at quite a significant cost. And some public bodies would say that that cost can be justified if they are using the ability to interrogate expenditure and where the money is spent to potentially identify cost savings. Now, that may or may not actually result in carbon savings, but it's one reason why some public bodies have gone down that route. Other public bodies do have, again, as Hannah said, limited resources or perhaps unclear where to start and have held back in part because of this research. When it comes to measuring emissions and reporting those emissions, that's all very well, but obviously that's not actually going to deliver reduction in emissions without action in contracts and without working with suppliers. And the research certainly has found that there's varying confidence in the ability or the understanding of public bodies about how they apply relevant climate change requirements within contracts. Inevitably, there's some good work in various sectors. Construction, there's a lot of work going on in construction, of course, and infrastructure. And other sectors, there is less confidence in how to apply it. And also the new standardized statement that was included within the single procurement document a year or so ago, there appears to be relatively limited use of that so far. In terms of methodologies that are out there, and that research into those 70 or so that we looked at, spend-based methodologies still dominate the market. And that, as I said, is because of the limit to the amount of supplier-specific data that's out there. Now, what this image shows you on the slide is, if you like, the progression from a focus purely on spend-based methodology to other methodologies and how that improves what we call specificity, if I can say the word. In other words, how specific is the data? How focused is it on supplier data as opposed to averages or purely spend-based? And as you're going across to the right, you're getting more and more specific. Now, I stress being specific as opposed to accurate, because you will get accuracy if you obtain reliable data. Now, one of the issues is making sure that you are actually getting reliable data from suppliers and through methodologies, which is why we focus on specificity at this stage rather than accuracy. But accuracy will follow if you work with suppliers and support them when necessary. So on the image, you'll see there's the various methodologies, spend-based. We've also got enhanced spend-based, because we're talking about those where there is additional granularity that may be included within them. And that granularity can relate to the ability to interrogate spend data down to purchase line ledger data, potentially, and therefore give you a much more granular, much more detailed analysis. And also some of that is being undertaken using artificial intelligence. So there's machine learning taking place to interrogate. And there are an increasing number of tools that are trying to do that in the market. The others on this space going to the right, the average data, hybrid, those are referred in the GHG protocol, if you're familiar with that. And they're looking at trying to get data based upon industry averages, for example, or developing a mixed hybrid approach where you're getting some data that is spend-based and some data from alternative sources, in particular suppliers. And it's important, the researchers emphasize that it's important to shift away from purely reliance on spend-based data over time, or as quickly as you reasonably can, and to focus more and more on supplier-specific data. Now, that means suppliers being able to calculate their emissions and report those emissions, and that could be through a supplier-driven, the suppliers doing that themselves, or it could be buyers, public bodies driving that approach by asking suppliers to report into particular portals or tools. From a supplier perspective and the survey that we undertook with them, some of the challenges that were highlighted, you won't be able to read all the text on the image, but there's a lot of challenges that have been addressed by suppliers. Inevitably, you will find that a lot of the larger suppliers are quite proactive and active in this space in terms of calculating their emissions and also looking at their own supply chain emissions. Again, that can vary from sector to sector. SMEs, smaller businesses, certainly struggling. Not all of them, but certainly are struggling. There are various free resources out there. We have the Net Zero Toolkit, for example, the SME Climate Hub and things like that that are freely available to SMEs to help them, and also the support from Scottish Enterprise. But there's a lot of uncertainty amongst suppliers, and whether that's in terms of how to assess emissions and how to then reduce those emissions, and also around the requirements of public bodies. What we don't want suppliers to be faced with is a situation where they are increasingly being asked to report into multiple portals and multiple platforms, because that just creates a burden for those suppliers. So part of the research was trying to understand what's happening in that space and where there are opportunities through greater collaboration across the public sector in terms of commonality, which I'll come on to in a second. The supplier-specific data that is being sought, well, it may well be their own Scope 1 and 2 emissions, as Hannah's indicated initially, and that tends to be the initial focus if you're looking for data from suppliers, and over time looking for evidence of how they're assessing their own Scope 3 emissions. In some cases, the emissions data might relate to environmental product declarations, data through those life cycle analysis that's taken place. But again, that depends on the sector. It depends on the supplier, because it can be a costly and time-consuming process. So it's not proportionate to expect all your suppliers to be able to do that for all products or commodities supplied. So there is quite often a reliance upon data based upon supplier scope 1 and 2 emissions, and then, if you like, the public body is applying a carbon intensity factor based upon their expenditure with the supplier. And as the image on the right shows you, that's really emphasizing the point about what we need to try and get to, which the research has borne out, is a shift away from purely reliance on spend data to more and more reliance on supplier-specific data. So in terms of options going forward, what action is needed, the report is making various suggestions, and they are options. They're not necessarily just one option. There may be a number. And the intention is to try and improve consistency in approach. And we do recognise that public bodies, as I said earlier, they vary in how they're dealing with this, varying in terms of where they are in this space, whether they've calculated supply chain emissions or not, whether they've started to work with suppliers to try and get data from them, whether they're building that in, therefore following a sort of hybrid approach, while other public bodies haven't started this yet because of resources or uncertainty. So more consistency without saying to those public bodies who've already made progress in this space, sorry, you've got to go back to square one. That would obviously be the wrong thing to do. So we need to try and get public bodies all progressing, depending where they are in this space at the moment. Those who've done nothing, the ability to progress rapidly. Those who've done something, the ability to progress still further. Reliability, as I mentioned, is also important. How can we get reliable data? How can we also ensure cost effectiveness through avoiding duplication of effort? There's a lot of local authorities on this call, and what we don't want is 32 local authorities doing 32 completely different things, devoting 32 funding or budgets, which will be a very expensive process. There's a lot of commonality and a lot of opportunities for collaboration. And part of this will be guidance, making sure that guidance is available to public bodies on the tools and methodologies out there. And also, as the image highlights, it's a simple visualization, if you like, of an improvement program or process to go through the initial screening of where your carbon hotspots are in the supply chain or in the procurement, using spend-based data. That's always going to be a starting point, but then moving on to focusing on priorities, gathering supplier data, and that in turn will improve the reporting, the ability of public bodies to report, increasing that number from 17, we would hope quite rapidly, but also reporting more meaningfully in terms of not just reporting based upon spend-based, but also reporting increasingly on supply-specific data going forward. Some public bodies will need help. Collaboration will obviously help that. As I mentioned, the shift to supplier data is important. We need to think about suppliers when it comes to that. We need to also think about, as I've mentioned a number of times, not just in terms of, okay, how do we measure these overall emissions and how do we report those as part of climate change reporting duties, but also how do we actually make practical implementation? How do we make practical changes through a focus on emissions where relevant, where proportionate, within contracts and within frameworks. And public bodies are, again, mixed in their approach. As I said, some feel more confident than others in terms of applying it. There's a lot of good examples out there. One of the issues that crops up quite consistently is contract management. Some uncertainty around how to measure and monitor the outcomes in a practical way. It will be relatively straightforward to identify a set of KPIs, but then you've got to ask yourself the question, can you reasonably measure those, monitor those? What is the market? Is it reasonable? Is it proportionate to ask for those KPIs to be reported on? The other thing is making sure that systems that public bodies have are capable of collecting information from suppliers in terms of outcomes, climate change outcomes, for example, where that's relevant, and collating them so that you're able to demonstrate how the procurement or the range of procurements have supported climate change objectives and how your emissions are reducing through that way. Again, there are some public bodies who are doing that. Other public bodies are probably less advanced in that space. The reporting, as I said, is another issue. It's important, and I think it's important to make sure that the reporting is not just a tick box exercise, but it also provides an opportunity to show how public bodies are progressing over time in their approach to getting more and more supplier data, which will improve the veracity, if you like, of the reporting. Collaboration is important. George has mentioned that. Certainly, that's very relevant. We do want to prevent duplication of effort. All public bodies have the opportunity to progress, and in particular, those ones who are struggling to know where to start at the moment. There are good practice examples around there. There's plenty of experience of using supply chain emissions tools or evaluating them. And also in terms of data, because there's a lot of commonality of suppliers and certainly procurement. That's not just a question of whether you're buying through, for example, Scotland Excel or other frameworks. You'll also find that there may be commonality in terms of suppliers across public bodies. And therefore, if one public body is asking for emissions data from one supplier, and then that supplier is getting the same request from another 100 public bodies, that's not very efficient. So if there are ways that we can try and make sure that that burden is restricted or limited or avoided completely, to ease that, then so much the better. Guidance for suppliers, making sure they know what to do, where they can get support from, be it Scottish Enterprise or others. Again, to ease that reporting will be important as well. Okay, so that's my whistle-stop tour into the research. As I stressed, the research will be published on the CXC website in the not-too-distant future, but thank you for that, and I'll be happy to take any questions much later on. Over to you, George.
Thank you very much, Phil. Speakers today keeping my life easy, coming in ahead of time. Phil covered a lot of ground there. And obviously, as Phil mentions, this is leading to a report that you'll see more detail, but that's giving you a fair sense of what the report covers and some of the insights and maybe some of the avenues forward. I've noticed that there's at least a comment in the chat. Please, if you've got questions that are bubbling up, pop them in the chat. We'll log them, keep an eye on them. And when we get close to sort of 3 o'clock, we'll sort of open it up for Q&A. So really, we'd welcome delegates' thoughts in terms of, how is this sounding? How do we collaborate together? How do we actually get into deeper collaboration in terms of really sort of knocking down some of the barriers to make progress? And how do we take some of the interest that's being shown in this event? How do we actually take steps forward from today? So we're just going to sort of pivot towards a speaker from Scotland Excel, Mary Mitchell. Going to start to dig into, I suppose, the whole process around collaboration through contract management, contract specification, maybe working with suppliers. So Mary, just hand over to yourself. Phil, if you could stop sharing your screen, I think.
Thanks very much,
fantastic,
George.
Thank you very much.
That was going to be my first request, was now just if you could let me know if that has popped up on your screen yet.
Yeah, looks okay to me. It's a little bit small, but I don't know if there's a setting, but otherwise we can see it. It's not a problem. No, it's looking okay. It's looking okay.
Excellent, thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. I'd first of all just like to acknowledge the impressive numbers that have committed the time to come and hear from us today. Very, very pleased that it's been such a session that's taken so many people's interest. So I'm Mary Mitchell. I'm a manager at Scotland Excel, and I'm going to speak about developing Scotland Excel's energy efficiency contractors framework and how we took a collaborative approach to supporting the delivery of net zero objectives for our membership. So moving, I just have to remember to speak and move on. I'm conscious that we've got quite a diverse audience today, so I just wanted to touch quickly on our organisational context. Scotland Excel, for those of you that are less familiar with this, is the procurement centre of expertise for local government. We've been around since 2008. We're governed by a joint committee made up of elected members of the 32 local authorities. We cover a range of goods, services and works frameworks for our membership. They're designed to help our members deliver all of a good range of the services that communities need. And they stretch, as the slide says, through the more heavy-duty equipment, for example, in transport and environment, through to the softer services and social care. Cover corporate and ICT services for councils and goods, food in school dinners as an example. And also, and more relevant to what I'm going to say today, we have a portfolio of construction contracts, and energy efficiency sits within that framework, in that category. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the point at which we came due to retender our energy efficiency advice framework. And that's some time ago now, before the world went a little mad as it did in 2020. But even at that time, we were considering how would this sit within the kind of policy context and the landscape for delivery of public services that we were operating within. So the policy objective landscape, and I think this kind of touches on some of the things that we were taking in consideration at that point, to reduce Scotland's emissions of all greenhouse gases to net zero by 2045. At that point, there was interim targets set out for the achievement of this, and were published in the Energy Efficiency Scotland route map. Over that period of time, we also took the learning from the previous framework and considered how we had to widen out the scope of that. And we knew that collaboration with external experts and partners was going to be key to whatever we put into that renewed framework. So the energy efficiency contractors framework was going to be a key driver for our members in getting their built environment in a practical sense closer towards those targets, but also within that considering how our members, when they use this framework, could contribute to a greener economy, could tackle fuel poverty for the residents of the domestic dwellings that were relevant to this framework, and also an overall reduction in the carbon emissions that were associated with the services that councils and housing associations in particular in this context were offering to their tenants. So we wanted to create a mechanism that would facilitate that. The main outputs, I suppose, from the framework were the upgrading of existing housing stock with more innovative and lower emission energy efficiency measures. And by lower emission there, I mean perhaps in the materials as well as the measures that were introduced into the properties here. The overall carbon emission of the building being particularly relevant, but also quite key, the reduction in household bills for tenants in residential properties, and also the revenue cost to our membership of operating non-domestic properties where they had used the framework to make changes there. So all kind of connected to what you've heard from previous speakers about the need for change and the need for I suppose a measurable difference, as they start to get into the detail of the data, being able to evidence that change is bringing forward something positive. So in terms of getting to something practical that we could offer to our membership, we got into some early dialogue with key stakeholders to ensure that the procurement strategy was developed in such a way that would facilitate the delivery of all of what I've mentioned already, but also would be relevant in the context of the energy efficiency standard for social housing, EIS 2, you'll have heard it referred to, and the obligations that were set out in that Energy Efficient Scotland route map that I mentioned. A core component of that, as with every framework we do, was the technical representation for our user intelligence group and their role in scoping how works packages would be established, helping those of us working in the procurement space to understand how work would be awarded and what sort of volumes and levels of participation could be expected to come through this. So what sort of capacity did we need to try and create through that? As part of that kind of key stakeholder work, we started speaking to BRE Group Scotland. COSLA came to the table with us, Warnworks Scotland as well, the Scottish Government. We engaged through the Energy Efficient Scotland area-based scheme as well, Sustainable Energy Supply Chain Programme, and the Energy Efficient Scotland programme. So a lot of key players in those conversations about what does this need to look like and what does it need to be able to do. Through that, we made some significant changes compared to the previous generation of the framework. However, when that work started, we hadn't foreseen where it might have to develop, the sort of context in which it might have to develop. So we found ourselves in March 2020, as everyone did, having a slightly different set of challenges on our hands in terms of facilitating a collaborative conversation about what this framework needed to do. And that was in the context, for those of you that maybe have blocked some of this out, but construction sites were closed. So some of the supply base conversations that we would normally have in the shaping of a framework were not as easily accessible as they would have been previously. Those of you working in public services will know that you had other priorities to attend to. So facilitating some of those conversations with the people who would use the frameworks were very different at that point. We then kind of got into the materials and even being able to speak to people about what materials were going to be available for installation, for example. That was quite a different conversation from what we envisaged as well. And then sort of longer term impacts, I suppose, things like as those that operated social housing came back online, the backlog of emergency repairs had an impact on how this framework was going to be used as well. So things that we hadn't necessarily envisaged started to come into play at that point too. And as we'll all recall, and we're still dealing with some of the rising costs. Shipping had a significant peak probably early 2021 and has fluctuated a bit since as well. The cost of energy, inflation in general, material shortages and restrictions on all kinds of things that played a part in the conversations we were able to have about how this framework needed to look. However, I suppose this is one of those never waste a good crisis sort of conversations, but the importance of delivering this framework was actually clearer, I think, to many people that these measures are going to be increasingly important given things like the rise in energy costs. So, as I say, there's always a silver lining, I suppose. So in terms of collaborating on what we needed the framework to do, we focused in all three of these areas. We, I suppose in terms of the policy, I've probably covered enough of that, but it's worth saying that when we moved into thinking about the skills capacity in the market, that became quite apparent that there were going to be challenges for all of us using this framework in terms of how much skilled labour was going to be available for delivery of the framework. And at that point, our collaboration with John Rennick from ESP, Energy Skills Partnership, started. And he became a key partner, and with his team, became a key partner in terms of developing what we wanted that framework to do, and also helping us to make new industry connections that we hadn't previously had. We've worked in collaboration with ESP to explore how we would enhance the quality of work and also support the development of skills in the industry. since they awarded the framework, we've carried on with this collaborative work. The 46 contractors that ended up awarded a place on this framework were invited to mobilisation sessions that were held with 2 colleges, one at West College Scotland and one at Forth Valley College. And these skills explained the mechanics of the framework and focused on the skills and funding opportunities for contractor base to support the just transition, and to acknowledge, I suppose, some of the challenges we were aware they were having in this quite rapidly changing industry. ESP introduced as part of this the installer skills matrix and have stated that the impact of introducing this to this contractor base has been much greater than they'd either expected or hoped. So that's been a positive from that aspect of the collaboration. And all of that was about driving up the quality as the third leg of the stool, if you like, on that slide. So in terms of the technical specification, was further collaboration in this area too. One of the main challenges, anyway, of developing the specification was the requirement to include past 2035, which for those of you that are outside of this particular piece of work is a new, or at that time was a newer protocol-based standard for energy efficiency. And to understand how that would impact on what we had to do in Scotland to adhere to it. So one of the critical parties to that, and again, we have thanks to ESP for our introduction to him, but was Professor Sean Smith, who's the Chair of Future Construction at the University of Edinburgh. And Sean used his own connections and contacts in the construction industry to help us establish a technical subgroup below the group that we had previously established with our membership, to look at the particular specification elements that needed to be in this framework in order to meet the requirements. And this led to a further piece of collaboration with BRS, who are mentioned on this slide as well. That's Building Research Solutions, that supported us to develop the detail of that technical specification. So by now you're seeing a whole number of parties involved there, through from our membership to various people that had specific knowledge in the industry. And all of this, as I said, in the context of having to move to working online and building some of those relationships that hadn't existed prior to COVID online. And I know all of us on this call will have done that, but at the early stages of that felt a little bit strange. So, so moving on to what came out of all of that collaboration. So essentially, really about improvement, making the shape of the framework better in order to achieve some of these key policy objectives that we've touched on in this call, earlier in this call. But also the social impact in there and the environmental benefits that can be created for our membership through use of the framework. And I don't know that I particularly want to say an awful lot more about the policy side of that, but what we did find was interesting from our point of view was the range of contractors that were interested in this framework. So we've split the framework up into quite a detailed sublotting structure. So we have 4 primary lots on it, but the sublotting allows quite small packages of work to be awarded where appropriate, and quite specific to skill sets that contractors have. And again, the range, I mentioned that there's 46 contractors on there already. The range of contractors gives our membership opportunities for further competition within that, and to allow the contractors there to bid for work that's reflective of their expertise. So lets you get into kind of quite detailed pieces of work if you need to. And all of this with the appropriate accreditations, etc. So to get it kind of up and running, one of the things that we did was there's no point in having all of this in place, and the benefit of all that collaboration is lost if we don't take a collaborative approach to using the framework. So we set up a launch event for the framework, which involved pretty much all of the people I've mentioned, We got the day launched by Patrick Harvey, which pleased us no end, the Minister at that time for Zero Carbon Buildings, Active Travel and Tenants' Rights. He did make a joke, I think, about that snappy title he had at that point. And then he was followed by a range of speakers who touched on many of the aspects of the framework that I've talked about today. And the Minister actually picked up through his I suppose discussions, casual chats across the day with suppliers, etc. He had asked us to follow up on a number of points, and this has led to a little bit more collaboration with his office actually on how we can help with other pieces of work. So another aspect of collaboration that we hadn't expected out of that. Further to that as well, it has probably meant that we, Scotland Excel, have been asked to speak about this framework, a number of other events, possibly today being one of those. And I suppose the access to that network of expertise that the Energy Efficiency Contractors Framework has brought together has helped us inform other conversations in other frameworks that we're taking forward. We've also, I suppose, built on it by getting into a further, more strategic partnership with BEST, with the enterprise organisations. Zero Waste Scotland, we've always had a good relationship with, but getting into different conversations with different stakeholders there. So all of that kind of collaborative approach has helped us with the overall approach to collaboration on some of these more policy-driven frameworks that we work on. Just to kind of recap, I suppose, on how the framework landed. I mentioned that there were 46 contractors. Vast majority are based in Scotland, and quite a good range of them are much smaller businesses than you might expect. So you'll see the information up there. At the end of October, we were running at 58 projects, and I'm aware of 2 or 3 others that are kind of under discussion. And at that point, 21 of the 32 local authorities had something live on the framework, with 9 of our associate members, mostly housing associations, also working with the framework. And a good proportion of what has been awarded under the framework has been awarded to those smaller businesses, which, given the proportion of them that are there. And one such micro business was thrilled to have been, this is a little testimonial from one of our suppliers on the framework, but that was quite gratifying to us because we don't always get the opportunity to involve some of the smaller businesses in some of these big works frameworks. So that has been a positive from our perspective, and I suppose touches on what I said about the contributing to green recovery. And the sorts of measures that are being carried out under the framework, and these are just 2 or 3 photographs of projects that have come up under the framework, but insulation, alternative heating measures, and the lot 4 of the framework includes solar power, and batteries, etc., storage mechanisms for alternative energy as well. And quite gratifyingly, again for us, we have a couple of times had acknowledgement of the benefit this collaborative ethos towards this framework has had, and we won both. We being Scotland Excel, I suppose. But we as a community won both the Scottish National Go Award for the first ever the Scottish Go Award for the first ever collaborative procurement initiative, but also the National Go Award in Birmingham earlier this year as well. And that's us all there in our glad rags being quite excited about that. That in itself is a bit of an icing on the cake, but I think it helped us to understand how different this approach was and how much that was seen as kind of a pathway to improving offerings under national frameworks such as this. I'm going to hand back to George there. He's in charge of questions. I'm not going to seek any directly from you just now, but thank you very much for your attention.
Perfect. Thanks very much for that presentation, Mary. When I saw your slides, I thought there's a huge amount of information that you're getting across here, but you've done it so clearly and succinctly that I think there's a lot for us to sort of dig into. And it touches on some of the questions that have already been raised in terms of where are the examples of good practice. Here's a specific example that we can all learn from, that we can share with others. It's one award, so let's make sure that that's not just a sort of one-off example, that this actually becomes more of a norm across the public sector. Can I just ask all the speakers, Judy, you've put your camera on, but all the speakers just to pop their cameras on. It'd be great to see everybody. And then we do have some comments in the chat, but I don't know if there's any questions that people want to sort of fire in verbally. If you just, like I say, pop your hand up on Teams and I'll keep an eye out and I'll pull you in as best as I can. Just give you 2 seconds to sort of mull on whether you want to stick your hand up and come in with a question. And at the moment, is there anything in the chat that speakers want to pick up on? There's certainly a couple of comments there, I suppose, really pointing to the issue around how do we improve the collaboration, how do we improve the coordination. We've got a range of sort of national stakeholders here. We've got delegates from a range of sort of public sector bodies. We're trying to work as a sort of community of practice. Any thoughts in terms of where we currently stand? Joe, Hannah, I'm conscious there's a huge amount of work that goes on in the Scottish Government trying to, partly yourselves, trying to chart a course forward in a very, very busy landscape. You know, a whole range of things coming towards you, civil servants, etc. I don't know if you've got any reflections in terms of where you think we're at the moment. We've commissioned the CXE research, but I noticed, Hannah, you've popped something in the chat there from UK Government. And there's more and more interest in this space from scrutiny bodies. So any just reflections in terms of what we've heard so far, or where you think we might be sitting in terms of next steps on this?
I think we've both got probably contributions to make here. I'll just go first, if that's okay, Hannah. So I think for us, that's why we set up the Climate Procurement Forum in 2019, because we wanted to try and make sure that people weren't duplicating effort. And we obviously reviewed the structure of that late last year at the start of this year. So we started off with a focus on capability with climate literacy. We've worked obviously very closely with our climate change colleagues to sort of say, you know, just one set of reporting, which was always the policy intention. And sometimes you forget, you know, maybe this is difficult to communicate things, make sure it reaches everybody. So obviously done a series of policy notes and put it in both climate guidance and in procurement guidance, that the intention is that, you know, there is a requirement in Climate Change Act. We kind of linked that to the sustainable procurement duty for people to report on climate and procurement. But I think what we've really tried to be very strong on, and what seems to be coming out in the research, is that be really, really careful about getting attached to spend and emissions, because we really have concerns, and this goes to other things that we've done in the past. You know, that if we start by counting the wrong things, then you know it can actually be really detrimental to, and Hannah pointed this out in her presentation, to what you're trying to achieve. So I suppose we feel like we've got a structure, but sometimes it feels like you're dotting about on this. So one of the things is, you know, having looked at various things like updating guidance, you know, the tools already existed, and we think they provide quite a good route for people to actually identify their hotspots. This kind of, I mean, permission sounds a bit grand, but the idea in the policy notes, the permission to say we're not expecting everybody to know the answer immediately, and to give people the confidence to actually prioritise the things they buy, and to hone in on a few really hotspot projects and on a rolling basis to actually address those. And I think, you know, with the reorganisation of the Climate Procurement Forum at the start of this year, that's very much the direction of travel for the forum. So I suppose that's really some of the work we've been doing. And of course, we, you know, this research will help with developing the statutory guidance and a procurement chapter in that. Hannah.
Great. Hannah, do you want to pick up anything on that? I'm conscious of, you know, we've got a process underway. You put it in the presentation in terms of the statutory guidance. We've managed the public body's climate change duties reporting. So opportunities to consolidate and have one rule book, an improved sort of efficiency of reporting from the public sector. I think we're very conscious of the burden of reporting. There's an overall sort of desire to have less but better reporting across all public sector bodies. Any thoughts in terms of next steps around that agenda?
I'm sure most people on the call are aware that there's the Environmental Standards Scotland investigation report coming soon. I think once that's published, there'll be things that need taken forwards. But I think what's really important, which we have talked about, is that we don't endlessly just count the beans. Basically, that the resources are really focused on trying to drive action, because that's what the whole exercise is about. It is about emissions reductions, and when bodies are really short of resource, which we know that they are, we would really like, you know, a lot of that focus to be on action rather than on counting. But we'll there's lots of stuff that I think will come out over the next couple of months, and I think we'll be able to talk in more detail then once the actual ESS report is published.
Fantastic. Super. I see Roddy Yar. Roddy, I think you're at Glasgow University now. Do you want to come in and give us your thoughts?
If I may. Yeah, I did ask a question. Thanks, George, and thanks everyone for presenting such really helpful and useful information. I find it very, very, very good indeed, which is probably why there are so many people on the call. I put a note in the chat about EcoVadis, which I'm sure we're all fairly familiar with. But yeah, so I have a question around that as the process. How can we improve existing processes to try and harness the information that we all want to get access to? So I suppose that's the main point of the question. But I'm just really reflecting the real challenge that we think we've got as a university and within the university sector in the UK, because I'm part of a network that looks at all of this in my role as a sustainability lead. We don't currently report our supply chain emissions. We've used the HESA tool that the public sector, higher education sector's got access to do the financial proxy, as George mentioned at the start. But I think if we don't tackle this issue at source, so to speak, all we're doing is adding to the net emissions that we have to somehow offset or sequester somehow. So, which we have no idea how we're going to do that. We're trying hard to deal with that as well. So I don't really have a question around that, but I really, you know, we want to be engaged in this process to try and help engage with our supply chain. We are doing construction work with our tier 1 contractors, as again was noted, but it's the equipment that we buy. We have a big medical, you know, anyway, I won't go into detail. It's just a call to reach out to the HE sector, because we want to try and help and be part of the solution, not be part of the ultimate net emission problem that we're all going to have to deal with as well. Yeah. Regardless for net zero. So yeah, just thanks and just a light observation in that regard. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Roddy. I think at the very least, for a range of reasons, Scope 3 emissions are definitely on the radar and in the room. So I think it's a healthy position that we're in the sense that we're not sort of trying to keep it, out of our line of view. You know, we're not sort of ignoring them. We're not just getting reports in. We're not having conversations in the SSM, which is just about putting our own house in order. So I think it's a healthy position that we're in. I think everybody is grappling with this challenge. I'm certainly often sort of out with the public sector, you know, private sector organisations likewise sort of staring into this challenge. And I think one of the critical things for me is how do we use the opportunity that procurement allows us? So it actually puts us more on the front foot. It's an opportunity to really leverage change and help shift markets in the direction that we want to see them head. And the last thing we want is this big scary sort of number being measured through whatever means just being a stick to hit the public sector. That's not what we need. I would really welcome thoughts from delegates and speakers in terms of even just some insights in terms of where did it work well elsewhere and how do we maybe sort of coordinate and pull strengths together. On your specifics, Roddy, around universities and colleges, EAUC, which is Environmental Association Universities and Colleges, is on the SSN steering group. There are university reps and college reps on the steering group. So I would I'm more than happy to take this conversation away and make sure that it sort of features into the SSN steering group's deliberations in this space. And I know university and colleges, you're facing, if nothing else, a huge growth agenda. So you're almost running to keep up in terms of more and more demand in terms of buildings and materials and service provision. So that must play into the equation as well. Any comments from colleagues? Speakers from today, reflections? Phil, I don't know how this maybe chimes with your experience. You've worked with a lot of the guys that are on the call today within the public sector. You're looking at this through the CXC research. Any thoughts, reflections? You're just on mute there, Phil.
Should have learnt by now. Picking up on your point, Roddy, I think about the higher education sector, part of the research was looking at obviously what was happening in Scotland, but also elsewhere where that was relevant. And I did have conversations with people like the University of Nottingham, who have developed their own tool, which enables suppliers to identify which universities they supply to. Okay, this is an England focus, rather than having to report to numerous universities. They can just put the data in once. Now, you mentioned EcoVadis. Obviously, that's the same sort of principle that EcoVadis has, trying to avoid the number of portals or platforms that people have to report into. But EcoVadis has a more sort of generalist approach in terms of sustainability, isn't specifically geared up for numbers in terms of carbon data. But any way that you can ease the way that suppliers can report emissions and therefore the information that public bodies can get, it helps. In some cases, it means that public bodies can get data without doing anything because somebody else has already asked the question and it's readily available. Now, that's something for sectors perhaps to think about. And obviously, the HEFE sector has using EcoVadis. The NHS sector is now using NHS Evergreen, which is the cross-UK approach to reporting sustainability. So there is some work in this space, but I think there's still a lot more opportunity in terms of commonality, because otherwise all the individual public bodies on this call will go away and think, well, I need to talk to that supplier, and somebody else will think, I need to talk to the same supplier. Well, it's a lot of duplication of effort potentially that could take place. But there are other things I could pick up on, but I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Great. Super. Thanks for those insights. There's a couple of things kicking around my mind. A lot of this is about how do we actually put some resource into national coordination. So we get collaboration, but we need it sort of coordinated. And there's sort of three things in my mind. One, Judy, I'm thinking about, we're in the midst of bringing forward the Climate Intelligence Service. That's an example of really quite active sort of collaboration on area-based emissions. So there's maybe something in that line of thinking that we need to sort of map across to the sort of Scope 3 challenges. I'm thinking about Mary, I think it was yourself, mentioned Sean Smith at Edinburgh University. We've done a bit of work with Sean. He's got a whole programme of work around trying to make heat in buildings easier to grapple with. So archetypes. So he's sort of saying, look, we've got similar buildings, so let's sort of cluster what the solutions are. And there's maybe something from that we could do in terms of procurement, buying and using similar things, working with similar suppliers. Maybe there's some archetype work that we can do here. And then I'm thinking SSN's own work around public bodies reporting. We're just in the mix in terms of coordinated approach, more reasonably consistent guidance, the templates, the analysis, etc. So there's a range of sort of skills that could maybe be hived across more actively into the Scope 3 sort of procurement emission space. I don't know if there's any reflections from colleagues on some of that. Judy, I'm thinking IS's work is strewn with shared service approaches, collaborative approaches, either on climate or elsewhere. So there's maybe some work that we can do with improvement service more actively in this space, at least learning what works in terms of shared service approaches elsewhere.
definitely. I was about to come back on that, and I saw a hand come up. So I'll bring you in, Linda, because we do want to give people a chance to come in. Thanks, though, George, and definitely thanks, Linda.
Yes, Linda.
Sorry, that was an error. Sorry, apologies.
It's okay.
No worries. Yes, no, I was just going to come in and agree, really, George. And I suppose this is possibly slightly more for Phil, although Mary, I think that you've sort of that practical example of it. But I would be interested in sort of the how. And I think that so there's a question in the chat of what are these examples of good practices. I think for me, Phil, when you were in your presentation, you hinted at that sort of some examples around the contract management, not just the sort of frameworks. And I guess I'd just be interested if yeah, I'm sure Joe, you maybe have some thoughts on this as well, but Phil and Mary maybe in particular of sort of that journey and how you build that confidence. You mentioned confidence a couple of times. How you build the confidence, how you sort of build those collaborations, any lessons learned perhaps from that journey. And I think Mary, your example there, award-winning example, but use some other examples of sort of things that people could weave in if that's not putting you on the spot too much. Thank you.
Yep.
I don't know whether it's me or Phil there, but
you kick off and we'll come to Phil.
I think it's some of the things you've just touched on, Judy, and your question, George, about archetypes in particular, are things we've kind of grappled with, almost that what is the most elegant solution in any sphere of purchasing, as it were, which products, services, works, contracts would deliver most effectively. And I suppose only collaboration is going to take us there. The understanding of the composition of the products or the materials to be used in a works project, but also within our procurement community, those of us that are actually instructing the work. So those in local authorities or housing associations, if we're thinking about the energy efficiency contractors, determining what they want to agree on, I suppose, in terms of which solutions might be the most effective for them. And I think that's kind of similar to the data challenge, if it's not too crude to call it that, Phil, but the challenges of measuring in a common way. I think we'll have similar conversations to be had about buying in the same way. Where is that sweet spot without having detrimental impacts on our economy, by channeling all of our spend into a particular solution. So not an easy one to answer, and lots of strands to it. But certainly I think getting into those conversations about what do we want this to look like and how do we involve all parties, including industry, in that. And some of the things we're already doing nationally, I think, are about trying to get to that. Certainly the supply chain development programme and links through them, things like the Heat Network Support Unit, all of those sort of bodies that are looking at different things that need to be done and just making sure we're all parties to those conversations.
Super. Phil, any thoughts?
Yeah, thanks, Mary. No, I'd certainly agree with what you've said. I think you've just alluded to it. I think not every public body is at the same stage in this space, and not every supplier is at the same stage in this space. There are public bodies, as I mentioned earlier, who have progressed quite well in terms of measuring emissions and then focusing on key suppliers or priority suppliers. And we can't get away without talking about priorities or prioritization, because you need to focus on those contracts or frameworks or markets and suppliers where the biggest opportunities are, where the biggest impacts in terms of carbon reduction can be made. So making sure you're clear about where those priorities are is important. And as part of that, we've been doing some work, or today I've been looking at a local authority and the prioritization of their forward plan from a climate perspective. And as I was doing it, I was thinking, well, I've done this before for other local authorities, and I think, well, a lot of spend across local authorities is quite similar. Okay, it can vary according to the local agenda and the scale of the organisation, of course, but there is some commonality, and therefore rather than doing this 32 times, we might be able to do it once and then tweak it a little bit for each local authority. Now that takes you as far as identifying those hotspots and identifying in the internal capability perspective, who you need to focus on and which markets and suppliers you need to focus on. And as part of the survey, we asked public bodies around what they had done regarding climate and in the procurement cycle. And the public procurement strategy has very clearly highlighted that supplier engagement, supplier development is a key enabling mechanism for net zero transition. But the evidence through the research, perhaps that's not as active as perhaps it needs to be. It needs to be perhaps a bit more targeted and a bit more focused, a bit more effort devoted to it. Now, if you're a small public body, you may say, well, okay, I don't know where to start and who I should talk to. So in terms of the collaboration side of things, there will be plenty of opportunities for everyone to learn from each other and how to do this and how they have done this. But what you don't want is public bodies who are in the past have struggled with this and knowing where to start, feeling daunted by it because they're hearing all these fantastic lessons from other public bodies who've done all this great stuff, and they think, well, this is great, but what I really need to know is what I should do and how I should make progress in this. So the collaboration, I think, needs to recognise the distinction in terms of where public bodies are in this space and where their markets are in this space.
Super. That certainly changed a lot of our experience. I was across in Fife earlier today, and my last slide was the climate emergency leaders checklist that SSN, IS developed together, SOLAS, etc. involved. And that's very much a maturity to say public bodies are at different stages, so you need to work with where people are at. And Hannah, we're developing a sort of stripped down carbon management plan for some of the smaller public bodies, just to make it an awful lot more straightforward, see the wood for the trees, and relevant to where the public body's at, both on its journey and its scope of influence and its function. So that certainly changed a lot of the SSN experience. Linda Haggart, you did have your hand up. I wondered if you still had a question. I don't know if you want to come in. Just say if you don't, it's not a problem. No. Any final questions whilst the clock is ticking?
I am. Oh, Joe. Sorry.
Joe.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I just wanted to mention, so there was a question about support for suppliers. So we actually met with Scottish Enterprise yesterday, and they are building their support for business on this. So it's really important. Just look under I didn't Google it, so find business support, I know. But they're at the moment, for example, so we were developing the single procurement document question guidance. Standardized statements, not a question, didn't change the question, obviously. We worked with them, and they had a tool that we felt mapped very well with the question for smaller Scottish suppliers, but they've actually come much further than that in the last year or so, and they've done some sort of small cohorts of sort of getting Scottish businesses up to speed on emissions and climate change. So yeah, there's a growing support in, for example, Scottish Enterprise, and similarly in terms of people who are interested in bidding for public sector contracts, definitely some content from Supplier Development Programme. Rachel, see the question. Nice to see you. It's just Google find business support, and it's really really easy to find. So just have a look there. It's probably the best one to use because they're developing their offering. So a year and a half ago when we first spoke to them, they were going online with the little thing that we've recommended, and now they've gone into this sort of cohort approach which they're piloting at the moment.
For that, Joe. Some of this is a communication challenge in terms of, communicating the right things to the right folks across the public sector. SSM plays into that space. Have a look at our website. There's a thing called the manual on the website. There's a section there on procurement. Be good to make sure that you're aware of that, but also any feedback in terms of elements that need to be updated and things that you can contribute, that whole sort of sharing of examples. We can only communicate what we actually find out from the wider SSM membership and folks like yourselves. And just to shout out in terms of spreading information about good practice, if you are working on good sort of procurement and climate change activity, make sure that you use the facilities of the SSM. We've got the monthly newsletter, the website, our events program, etc. So again, that's very much the lifeblood for what we can communicate to the wider public sector. We need folks like yourselves coming towards us just to sort of say, here, we've got something to talk about. And the last thing just to mention in that respect, your public body's climate change reports every year. Put your good examples into those documents. We are not spending a huge amount of time analysing that data set within the initial analysis, but it's there as a repository of good information. So if the stuff that you want to shout about, just a little bit of input to the public body's reports allows us and others to pick that up over time. Any other thoughts from colleagues? Just pop your hand up if you want to come in. Any questions in the chat that we want to pick up on? Phil?
Can I just mention that part of the research we looked, we spent a little bit of time looking at all the annual procurement reports that were submitted last year, just to try and identify what had been reported in terms of action within climate case studies or examples. And obviously some public bodies provided quite a lot of detail, some provided no detail, some provided a mixed level of detail. But we used that together with the other research we did in terms of case studies, desk research into case studies and others, to try and identify where good practice examples existed. And the research includes those that we've found or identified. We do know that there will be more than that, because you public bodies are a bit shy sometimes at coming forward with information for what you're doing on sustainable procurement and climate, etc. So the more examples, the better, because I think if we can end up with if you like, a repository of good practice across various stages of the procurement cycle, various different types of public bodies, different types of contracts, then that will provide, again, more confidence to public bodies on how they could do it themselves.
Fantastic. Thanks, Phil. And just on that point, in terms of case studies and sort of, putting your head above the parapet in terms of sharing that information, feel free to communicate with the SSN team, and I'm sure other colleagues on the call here. If you want to share something, but it's really sort of, just trying to get the information out there, you don't want to sort of blast it across websites and newsletters, feel free to come towards us to say, look, we've got something here we can share, but we want it to be a sort of semi-confidential conversation. We can enable that through the network. It's part of the reason why it's there. And that's all, I think, part of sharing the experience. How do we actually get things to happen, but also building up the trust across the public sector that we can share. It'll not be taken out of context, and it's actually about making progress, not sort of trying to put people on pedestals saying everything's perfect. So feel free to use the network as, in many ways, your asset, your network to try and progress work in this space. Conscious of the time, we're getting into the last 5 minutes or so. Does anybody want to come in with a question or a comment from the chat that we've just not picked up that you think, why have they not talked about that? There's a lot in the comments around consolidated approaches, sort of making life easier for the range of public sector bodies that are trying to grapple with this, making that efficient and effective as a cost-saving measure, so that we can actually get on and accelerate the delivery. So we'll certainly pick those up and sort of have a conversation after the event in terms of what some of the next steps are on those issues. I can see a couple of comments in terms of people having to rush off to other meetings, so let's keep the momentum going. We'll maybe get finished before past. Judy, and then Phil.
I saw Phil put his hand up, so it's maybe not for now, but I was just scrolling back through, and there was a question from Rona around apportionment of emissions. I don't. There's some nodding, Phil. So maybe we were great minds, but yeah, I'd be interested if there's time to sort of just cover that, because I think it's quite an interesting question. Back to everything we've talked about how you count the beans in a meaningful way. Thank you.
Yeah, I was. Thank you, Judy. I was picking up on the same one. I think it's a good question. I think, as I alluded to in the slides, if you can get product specific or service specific data, great, but there will be issues with that because of the time cost and the availability of data, etc. So apportioning it to a public body in some cases quite typically will be done by looking at the emissions for the organization, the supplier, its organizational emissions, and then prorating that according to your expenditure relative to their turnover. Now, it's an estimation, of course, but it's something that's been around for a number of years and is referenced within the GHG protocol as an alternative to, if you can't get really robust granular data in terms of products or services, then that is one way to do it. And inevitably, given the lack of or the limit to the amount of data that's available in the market, that may be the way to do it initially, in which case you need to make sure that supplier data that's been provided you in terms of scope 1 and 2 emissions that public bodies may well be getting. If you're using 4C7, the standardized statement, you might be getting that information through there. What are you going to do with it? Are you going to just say, I've tick box, move, forget it? Or are you going to store it, use it, and say, actually, I can use that for another purpose, which is to identify your supply chain emissions? You need to try and make sure that's reliable. So again, that comes back to the point with suppliers, the support for the suppliers to make sure that the data they're providing is as reliable as possible.
Great. Thanks for picking that up, Judy and Phil. Starting to get into maybe some of the training elements that might have to follow up in this space in terms of how do we help each other to understand some of these complications, complexities in terms of actually putting policies and principles into practice. Got 1 minute to go. Any burning issues that we've not covered or points that want to be flagged from speakers? Now's your chance before I just pull things to a close. Okie dokie. I think we've exhausted everybody in terms of comments and questions, so that's fantastic. Covered a lot in the 90 minutes or so that we've had. I just want to thank everybody for turning up today, despite the technology. You had, I think, about 3 meetings in your diary at one point. So glad that everybody's made it along to the right meeting. Thanks everybody for your contributions in terms of presentations. Really fantastic, I think, in terms of laying out where we're at the moment, some really important developments, the research that's coming forward and the practice that's in place in Scotland that we can draw on. So I think it's been a great example of collaboration and coordination for this event. Helene, thanks for your support in terms of pulling this all together, the promotion, the tech and the support from Scotland Excel. We've got a commitment to sort of follow up on this. I know there's a few conversations with delegates in terms of even sharing some good practice out of this, case studies, etc. So it'd be great if you can sort of stay involved, come to future events when you see them. One final little practical thing that you can do, there's a lot of people that I saw on the delegates list that are not plugged into SSN. Just drop us an email to ssn@ed.ac.uk. Just say you're interested in being on the membership list and we'll plug you in. You'll get the newsletter, access to the website, etc. Completely free. And we're just trying to build up that sort of, I don't know, the army, for want of a better term, in terms of who's going to push forward on this very sort of complex but very positive agenda here in Scotland. So yeah, get yourself plugged into SSN. We'll provide as much support as we can, and we're usually doing that with colleagues who are on this call, Scottish, everybody that's made this event a success. So at 1 minute past, half past, I'm going to let you go. Thank you very much for your time. This has been recorded. I think you'll get a copy of the recording and the presentations, and good luck with the rest of the afternoon. Thank you very much.